Hello again, folks. So recently I watched an anime called Kakiguri. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, even though they said it a billion times. My lips don't move that way, dude. Sorry. You're just gonna have to accept that. And if not, it's fine. You don't have to either. But that is just how she blows. But anyways, and it had this motif running through it that I thought was really interesting. It was about, like, gambling, especially in video games, and as it relates to pleasure, right? Because you can take gambling like poker and very easily make that a direct one-to-one correlation with a video game, and like a loot box, for instance. And there's almost this like actual connotation to it, if you know what I'm saying. I'm sure you can figure out an actual connotation to it, where like via gambling and via risking things, or it's sort of innately sinful. You can almost feel it. So, like, for instance, when I kill a demonic gorilla and then I get rune plate legs for the billionth time, I'm basically gambling my time away, right? For potential pixels, for no real benefit, right? It's all pointless. So, it's not nearly as self-harmy as like loot boxes or actual gambling. It's just I'm trading away my time for a potential at a drop. And if you look at it statistically and mathematically, I'm trading away my time and potential to eventually get something, right? But there's this element of perversion that I think exists throughout all of society, where you can attach like this lustful desire to things that like normally shouldn't be lustful. And as society progresses on more and more, I'm starting to notice this pattern, at least in my schizo brain, where like I can't help it. I see numbers, okay? I see patterns, but I'm seeing this like sort of almost like fetishization of a lot of these elements about video games and bringing it into the real world, and further corrupting society. And it really makes you wonder, like, I haven't read any papers on this or done too much research on the topic, because it's just something I've been a noticer. You're not allowed to notice things these days, but I can't help but being a noticer. And when I interact and I look at a lot of these things, like, is it just me, or are the like fetishes in the world just starting to get way too specific, way too like down to a point? And even in like this has always been a thing in Eastern media, right? Because they predict the year, like they're like us but 30 years in the future as far as a lot of these things go. And so I just have to then so I can sort of guesstimate what's coming just by what the agents are doing usually, right? And so when I see like this, everyone always jokes about like the perversions of the East or whatever, and a lot of their weird sort of elements. Like, and for instance, this one anime that was about gambling, like anime is literally called Gambling Addiction, I believe. And so the way it works is that it's taken like this element and attached this weird like actualization layer on top of it, and then mixed in like these sort of like scenarios and situations that don't really make sense. I don't want to spoil the anime, obviously, in case you do watch it, but I'm just like trying to explain how it applies to like greater society as a whole. And by doing this, you can sort of see the way that like through this one person's like corrupted lens, it sort of morphs the world. And it's like, let's compare it to something else, like say a foot fetishist or whatever, right? So the way that like a foot fetishist would like see the world, and how it would modify things, and how they can't really see feet in like a normal objective fashion, and how it sort of dominates their life or their thinking or whatever, as these primal desires get mingled on. And I'm sure like there's greater personality traits that links a lot of people to this. Maybe maybe it's even like a form of mental disease. Like, I, for instance, believe that gender dysphoria, people that are attracted to the same gender, people that are attracted to children, all of them just have a mental disease, right? And it's more about their personal struggle and overcoming their mental disease and living a normal life, rather than trying to embrace, especially on Pride Month, trying to embrace a lot of the degeneracy. And so when I look at something like societal decay, and like what I see coming forward in the future is more and more specific novelty perversions, and more specific like sort of fetishism of things that really aren't fetishes to begin with. At least if I expand the arrow of time and have it go forward, that's what I see is this kind of unique take on a lot of this. And when we're trying to like describe this or trying to imagine what this looks like in a Western connotation, like you can already see it with like the whole racial element, because everything in the West is idpol, so that's going to be a larger component of it than it already is. And then not only that, but it's almost like there'll be like this genocidal or suicidal urge, you know, against like the patriarchy or the controlling powers, or like Marxism personified. I imagine it almost as like, you know, some sort of fetishism of Marxist rhetoric, right? And sort of, you know, maybe the ultimate, like, it's sort of the same way, like, you could take, you know, like, for instance, the whole cross-dressing situation is like a fetishization and a deconstruction of women as a whole, right? And that's one very easy critical argument you could make against, you know, a lot of the pride movements. So let's just stick to cross-dressing for this one example, because it's obviously just a fetish. It's obviously just probably a, you know, either some sort of brain damage or mental disorder. I'm leaning towards a mental disorder if I had to pick, but if we're going to talk about it in that context, then, you know, that would be a way of describing things and a way of, like, fetishizing left-wing, you know, Marxist, dogmatist, pragmatist politics, and sort of as moving it into like a religious, like there's this underlying like fetishism of religion, right, that's been in existence since God knows how long, and it runs with this same sort of mental disease that a lot of the pastors have. That, you know, there have been multiple scandals about like the church and children, for instance. I'm not going to go into the specifics because talking about it makes me kind of sick, but, you know, there have been a lot of these like perversions that have existed throughout the millennia in relation to the previous religion, and now since wokeism and, you know, the next form of religion or form of understanding has these certain core values, you know, equity, not equality, has, you know, Marxist connotations to everything, critical theory off everything, you know, power structures and social structures are going to be the main determination. Those are going to be what is fetishized in the West as far as, you know, future cultural decay. So for the West, it's not, well, yeah, for the West, for, you know, the Judeo-Christian West, the future and the continued failings of it are going to be, instead of like tentacles, which I'm not going to go into why that might be in Glorious Nihon, but that's neither here nor there for the scope of this discussion. But like, so for instance, instead of something like that, you know, where it's like this revision to primalist history, it's going to be based around the fetishization of, say, you know, the female form. Like in cross-dressing, it's going to be like the British Broadcasting Corporation, if you get what I mean, as far as another like fetishization. And these two are already happening, right? And so going forward, then, it's going to be a fetishization of the government and power structures in and of itself. So, you know, think like uniforms are sexy, except sort of like fetishized, and maybe like, you know, you'll have like neo-Nazi, you know, forward-thinking like left-wing fetishists that are sort of acting out those kind of lustful indoctrinations out in the wider purview of society, right? And when you get right down to it, it'll be a fetishism of maybe even critical theory itself, right? So could being critical or being sardonic or a lot of these other virtues, so saith the left, by the way, not me, but so saith their virtues, could they now be fetishized too? So, you know, and then obviously if you look at the situation in Canada, you could say that there's like a fetishization for self-harm. In fact, the government advocating it as like a solution to your problems, right? So, you know, if you're faced with mental issues, or, you know, you're faced with something that's going to drastically decrease your quality of life, in Canada the solution is simple, right? Just simply end the person that is this guy serious? End the person that's experiencing that. I should start buying more from a single shop. I really don't know why I'm trying to save so much cash on like 3GP era. Yeah, you know what? I'm just gonna buy the whole thing. I don't care anymore. But yeah, like the fetishization of very specific, unique characteristics in a way that could only be really described as like modern day Marxist, you know, interloping. And that's an interesting concept as far as you can imagine the ways that like Marxist fetishism would go forward. If you look at the Chinese situation, am I short? And how many packs? I'm short 1. I guess I did not buy 1, right? Yeah, there we go. And so if you look at that and like just take a look at like the Chinese situation, for instance, and probably I don't know enough about Chinese culture to like rip it apart in this sort of way or analyze it at a deep level, just because it's so foreign, it's so hidden from the West. There's such a wall of propaganda. I can't really understand it in the context that I would need to be able to describe it in these terms. But you know, just from like a 10,000 foot overview, like understanding or analysis of what like the future in Chinese context or Chinese fetishism and decay would look like, you could say it's going to be something like, you know, instead of like, you know, great, I don't even know, like, it's tough because the things I want to say I can't say on YouTube, like, you know, a certain square somewhere or something, like, yeah, we'll talk about the fetishization of the tank in China, or like, you know, empathizing or finding the tank to be like in, you know, in a certain square incident that happened to be like the new symbol of fertility or whatever, right? And so there's no reason that something like that shouldn't realistically happen if you start embracing, like, if, you know, you've taken the steps past your initial color revolution and now you're fully enveloped in the sort of Marxist overthrow, even though China obviously is not real communism nor socialism. You know, it's basically an imperialist state at this point. It just doesn't want to admit it. Like, it is the future, you know. So if we're looking at that, then you can say statism is going to be the new, like, hotness, or the new thing all of the lurid deviants will be clinging on to. And how that's going to impact the internet age or the future going forward or societal decay is actually going to be pretty interesting. If I was like a sociologist, or, you know, I cared about studying these things more in depth, I would love to like run experiments on like a lot of the creation of these fetishes, and, you know, how they're basically ripping society apart, and how people develop like these unique elements. Like, I know this all started with like me watching a gambling anime and just taking a look at it as like an element of eroticism in Asia, you know, in an Asian culture, and then comparing it to like loot boxes here in the West. And then of course everything always ends with, you know, I can't wait until the West dies. But yeah, that's at least my thoughts on it. I wonder where you guys think as far as a lot of this degenerate stuff is going in the future. I think it could be, it's an interesting topic to think about, right? But I'll spare you my further musings on it. You have a great day.